The early period of Stalin's rule is known to the general public primarily for the immense scale of repression and terror against his own population. It is this that the Soviet 1930s are most often associated with. But if we look at this period more closely, the picture turns out to be somewhat more complex. In those same years, a massive industrialization was taking place in the Soviet Union. A country that had until recently remained largely agrarian was trying, within a single decade, to create heavy industry almost from scratch. And it is precisely this process that many historians consider one of the indirect causes of that same wave of repression. But there is another fact that usually remains outside this discussion. The main partner of the Soviet Union in the industrialization of the 1930s was not socialist countries at all. American companies, engineers, and architects played a significant role in the creation of Soviet industry. If simplified to a single sentence, it was the Americans who were the architects of Soviet industry. But what price was paid for this? Let's try to find out. The late 1920s were a difficult time on both sides of the ocean. The United States stood on the brink of a financial crisis that would go down in history as the Great Depression. But in the Soviet Union, the situation was even more difficult. Soviet Russia at that time remained a predominantly agrarian country with a very low level of mechanization of labor. Most of the population lived in rural areas, and the existing industry was far behind the United States, Britain, and Germany in both scale and technological level. It would be incorrect to say that the Bolsheviks, who had come to power in 1917, made no attempt to change this situation. In 1921, the new economic policy was introduced. It effectively meant a partial return to market mechanisms and was intended to lead the country out of the economic catastrophe caused by the Civil War and the policy of war communism. And to a certain extent, it did work. The economy began to recover. The key problem could not be solved by the new economic policy. The country still remained agrarian and industrial growth was far too slow. In the second half of the 1920s, the Bolsheviks increasingly began to speak about the need for a sharp industrial breakthrough. In party speeches of that time, the same idea was repeated again and again. We can no longer live off the village, the horse, and the peasant. We need factories, industry, energy, and technology. Between 1927 and 1929, the previous economic policy was gradually curtailed and replaced with centralized planning, the very planned economy that almost everyone has heard about today. The industrialization that followed was an attempt by the Soviets to travel in a single generation the path from an agrarian country to an industrial one, a path that had taken other states decades and sometimes even an entire century. And it is important to understand that this was not the modernization of existing industry, but the creation of it from scratch. At roughly the same time, the American architect Albert Kahn was offered a contract worth $40 million by the Soviet Foreign Trade Organization AMTORG to design several tractor factories. The United States at that time, I should remind you, stood on the brink of a major financial crisis. Because of this, the proposal from distant Russia turned out to be more than attractive for Kahn. By that time, he had already become the most famous industrial architect in America. Kahn took part in the large-scale rebuilding of Detroit, the capital of Henry Ford's automotive empire. It was for Ford that the architect built most of his factories. The speed at which the Americans worked was remarkable. About 400 architects and engineers worked in Kahn's bureau. It took them only 1 month to design a large factory, and about 5 more months to prepare the plant for the start of production. Albert Kahn arrived in Moscow together with 25 engineers, and within 2 years trained more than 4,000 Soviet specialists. Between 1929 and 1932, his team designed and organized the construction of 521 industrial facilities. The first Kahn factory in the USSR, the Stalingrad tractor plant, was essentially designed and built in the United States. It was then dismantled and delivered to the Soviet Union together with its equipment on 100 ships, where the plant was assembled again. The factory was almost an exact copy of a Caterpillar tractor plant. The Gorky automobile plant was designed and built according to the same principle. It began producing licensed copies of the Ford Model A and the Ford Model AA. Henry Ford himself never visited the Soviet Union and never had direct contact with the Soviet side. All negotiations and organizational matters were handled by his assistants. Ford was a convinced anti-communist and repeatedly expressed his negative attitude toward the Soviet Union and its socialist ideas. At the same time, it is fair to say that the speed of Soviet industrialization genuinely impressed him, and he mentioned this more than once in conversations with journalists. The fact remains that the convinced anti-communist Henry Ford stood at the origins of the Soviet automobile industry. Not for free, of course. The design of the plant, the transfer of licenses for 2 models, the organization of production, the training of workers, and the supply of equipment cost the Soviet side about $13 million. In today's terms, this is roughly equivalent to $250 million. Albert Kahn earned even more during his 3 years of work in the Soviet Union, about $2 billion in today's money. We will return to the question of money a little later. For now, it can be stated that the industrialization initiated by the Bolsheviks did indeed produce results. Entire branches of industry appeared in the country that had barely existed before: machine building, metallurgy, processing and extractive industries, the automobile industry, tractor production, and aviation. Large hydroelectric power stations were built. By the end of the 1930s, the Soviet Union ranked second in the world in industrial production, only to the United States. But the price that was paid for this turned out to be very high, and it was far from being only about money. To settle accounts with the American side, the Soviets needed a large amount of foreign currency, because the payments were made in dollars. The poor, or more precisely, impoverished, Soviet Russia of that time could obtain such currency only through the export of raw materials and food. The main exports were timber, furs, platinum, gold, and grain. Grain in particular became the main source of export revenue and foreign currency. You have most likely heard about the famine in the Soviet Union in the 1930s. Based on what has just been said, it is not difficult to compare the dates and see the connection between grain exports and the famine. But let us examine this question in more detail. To ensure uninterrupted grain supplies for export, the Bolsheviks needed to establish full control over agriculture. In the late 1920s, the so-called collectivization began, the merging of peasant farms into collective farms, and the introduction of a system of strict grain procurement in which the state determined how much grain had to be delivered. But this is the official language. In simpler terms, it meant the following: peasant farms, which for centuries had existed as private households, were required to unite into collective farms where land, tools, and livestock became common property. At the same time, a campaign of de-kulakization began. This was the name given to the elimination of the so-called kulaks, or wealthy peasants. In practice, this definition often included any households that were considered more successful. This meant the eviction of families, confiscation of property, and forced relocation of people to other regions of the country, often to remote and harsh areas. Those who were less fortunate were sent directly to labor camps. Officially, collectivization was presented as a progressive and necessary reform that would modernize agriculture. Soviet propaganda constantly emphasized that collectivization would reduce the share of manual labor, introduce tractors and new technologies, and increase agricultural productivity. In reality, the process was much harsher and far more chaotic. Mistakes at the local level played a major role. Orders were passed down from the top through the administrative chain, and at the regional level, much depended on the actions of local officials. In some places, the reform was carried out relatively cautiously, although still with difficulty. In other places, it was accompanied by serious abuses and violence. The state set mandatory grain delivery quotas, and every collective farm was required to hand over a fixed share of its harvest. If the quotas were not fulfilled, grain was seized by force. In some cases, villages were left with almost no reserves at all, including the grain people needed for their own survival. This effectively condemned entire villages to starvation. Against the background of these events, a massive famine developed in several regions of the Soviet Union in 1932 to 1933. According to different estimates, millions of people died. Even official Soviet figures speak of more than 10 million deaths. A deep demographic gap was created. In the countries and regions that experienced this famine, it remains a painful historical wound to this day. Industrialization and the agricultural transformations connected with it continued despite the unfolding tragedy. It was especially active in regions that were less affected by the famine. During these years, a mass migration of peasants from villages to cities began. This was partly made possible by the beginning of mechanization in agriculture. Tractors and agricultural machinery gradually reduced the need for manual labor. An even more important factor was something else. Millions of workers were needed at the construction sites of industrialization and at the new enterprises that were being built across the country during these years. The state's attitude toward workers was contradictory. On the one hand, the working class was considered the leading force of socialist society. Workers were glorified in newspapers, films, and on the radio. They were presented as the new heroes of the era. At the same time, the state demanded strict labor discipline. Strict production quotas were introduced, and working and living conditions often remained extremely harsh. From 1937, industrialization gradually changed its direction. First, some of its original goals had already been achieved. Second, both in the world and in the Soviet Union, the approach of a major war was becoming increasingly clear. Because of this, the main focus shifted to the development of the defense industry, tank production, aviation, and the manufacture of weapons. The plans that had been set could not be fully completed because of the outbreak of war with Nazi Germany. The result of industrialization turned out to be both grand and tragic at the same time. To this day, there is no single opinion or consensus on how this period should be evaluated. Most historians tend to believe that the methods used to take food from the peasantry and the consequences that followed should be considered a crime, and in many interpretations, even genocide. At the same time, a paradox exists. Even today, including among younger generations, there are still many people who try to justify it. To remain objective, it is worth presenting the arguments of those who consider these processes an unquestionable victory, and the sacrifices made in the name of this breakthrough justified. Beyond the obvious result, the creation of entire sectors of industry, one of the main achievements of industrialization is often described as the almost complete elimination of illiteracy. At the beginning of the 1920s, about 80% of the population in Soviet Russia was illiterate. For comparison, in the United States at the same time, the illiteracy rate was about 6%. The construction of factories inevitably led to the development of infrastructure. Schools, technical colleges, and universities were built across the country. Former peasants were taught basic literacy and technical professions at an accelerated pace. By the end of the 1930s, the illiteracy rate had fallen to just over 5%. Access to education is also often listed among the achievements of the Soviet system, since education was completely free. Another argument often made by supporters of industrialization sounds roughly like this. The children of peasants who, only a few decades earlier, could not read or write, later managed to create a space industry and send the first human into space. This argument again emphasizes the role of education and the industrial base that had been created. The final argument is heard most often. Without industrialization, there would have been no victory over Nazi Germany. According to supporters of this view, an agrarian and technologically backward country would hardly have been able to resist Hitler's army for long. If this position is summarized briefly, it can be reduced to a single thesis. Stalin committed a necessary evil. According to this argument, there were simply no good options at the time. Either the country went through painful industrialization, or it remained backward and vulnerable. You have now heard both interpretations of these events, and it is up to you to decide which of them seems more convincing. Did American companies know the price the Soviet side was paying to obtain the currency needed to settle accounts with them? Most likely they did, but they were probably focused primarily on fulfilling their contracts and doing their work. The United States officially recognized the Soviet Union only in 1933. By that time, most of the largest industrial enterprises had already been built, and the role of American specialists in Soviet industrialization was gradually declining.